Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning. Welcome to the 2014 Delaware Economic Summit. This is our first session. My name is Todd. I'm with Blue Rock Financial Group. We have Jim McMackin and Todd Bavol. I'm going to give them a brief introduction and then go ahead and let them get started. Thank you. Thank you. If you would like to connect to the Wi-Fi, go ahead and click into Weston Lobby. The password for that is West Hub, all lowercase, all one word, West Hub. Also, too, I heard someone say that they wanted to tweet about the session. If you want to do that, use hashtag EconDE. Lowercase ECON, capital D, capital D. All right. To my far left, Jim McMackin. Jim McMackin is with Morris James LLP, law firm in Wilmington. He is an attorney in the Employment, Government Relations, and Education Division. He represents the majority of Delaware school districts, numerous municipalities, and private employers. Jim also routinely functions as a primary counsel for state and federal court. Jim's peers recognize him as a leader in the field of employment litigation by nominating him to peer-reviewed recognition in Chambers USA, America's leading lawyers for business and Delaware super lawyers. Todd Bavol is President and Chief Executive Officer of Integrity Staffing. Todd's accountable for the overall leadership and vision of the company, with 20 years of staffing experience and prior experience in financial management and operations management. Todd is one of only 30 CEOs that make up the Philadelphia CEO Hall of Fame, as named by the Philadelphia Business Journal. He's also known throughout the USA as an expert on strategic workforce solutions. Todd's actually written 5 books on job search skills and strategic human resource topics. Also, one of the things that I thought was pretty cool. Todd was the 2011 recipient of the Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year Award. Todd,
Good. Well, thanks. This is going to be a nice group. I like that it's a small, intimate conversation. So we want to conduct it as such. So please make sure that you're participating. This is a conversation. It's not a presentation. Fortunately or unfortunately, over the last 17 years, I started my business here in Delaware, so we're a homegrown organization. I've gotten to learn a lot about the ins and outs of employment law and the regulations that continue to get placed on employers. So last year we WT'd around 100,000 people, so we know a lot about employment. And we know a lot of pitfalls that organizations like yours can probably face. Jim, anything you want to add before we get started?
What we really hope to accomplish today is to get you somewhat in the weeds so that you know enough to at least be dangerous, but to point out a lot of different topics for you to think about so that you can issue slow. There are things that hopefully you're going to learn today that you never even knew were something that you had to worry about, in addition to all the other things you need to worry about as business owners, managers, practice managers, whatever your duties. We hope there are things today that we're going to be able to teach you that this is something that we need to at least think about, at least have a conversation about before you act, because if you don't, there are some very serious repercussions.
Yeah. Before we get started, since it's such a small group, I'd love to know just the makeup of the group and what your individual roles are, or what type of companies you represent. Do you guys mind introducing yourselves? Great.
Mark Doty, small business owner of 2 different businesses and currently doing consulting for a company called Cardiac Connects.
Got it. Welcome.
Greg Graff, head Sherpa. My Sherpa, we do manage computer services for our clients.
Matt Sullivan, Marketing Communications.
Penny Virtue. I was an assistant manager for Marriott in 1975, and I own Appraisals Limited, and I'm associated with Cruise Real Estate.
Got it.
And I'm learning Spanish.
Oh, well.
Because the other 2 people, it's like a small real estate firm, the other 2 people speak Spanish, and I want to know what
Do I
they're
say Buenos Dias?
saying.
Buenos Dias, there we go. I don't know Spanish, but that's about all.
All right,
Well,
enough to be dangerous.
enough to be dangerous. See, there we go.
I understand.
Pleasure, welcome.
Todd, I'm in marketing, my wife Nancy, we're a full-service ad agency.
Got it. Fantastic.
Allison Morocco, I'm an attorney at Marsh Games with Jim and the Employment Group.
Super.
David Varney with the company corporation, general manager, and then my wife also owns a few hair salons.
Got it.
I just want to walk on the corporate side.
Understood. Well, good. Well, today we want to cover the following topics. First off, we want to talk about some of the things that you need to navigate through around background checking. These are hot topics with the EOC. Gone are the days where background checking is something Human Resources does that just checks the box, and you can just run a background check on just anyone for anything. There's a huge focus and scope narrowing on what you can and cannot use in your hiring decisions. So we're going to talk about that. Also around credit checks. We're also going to focus on some of the challenges and hot topics around the Americans with Disabilities Act and how your organization can help ensure that you're providing equal opportunity for folks who with disabilities. And we're also going to cover some things around severance agreements that are a new hot topic that may or may not impact your organization if you have to separate with someone. So those are some of the primary topics. We're also here, it's a small group, so if you guys have anything specific that you want to cover, please let us know, and if we have an expertise in that area, we'll be happy to share it with you. So let's start talking about background checks. Jim, share with the group some of the things that are going on.
Well, there's a lot going on, and it's a situation where, I mean, Todd's a business owner, a lot of us are business owners, and it's very easy to say that it's good business practice for me to run a background check or a criminal background check because I want to protect my business. And what do I want to protect my business from? Well, I want to protect from, employees stealing from me, employees who are using drugs, employees who have been convicted of crimes, maybe even like the negligence crimes. If I hire somebody who turns out to have committed crimes, they commit a crime against an employee of mine or against a client of mine, next thing you know, I'm getting sued for negligent hire, negligent entrustment. And then there's the whole, who are you as the court system to tell me who I can and cannot hire? I personally don't want to hire anybody who's been convicted of X, Y, or Z. And then look at the Navy Yard shooter case. I mean, there was a crime in the background, and it never came up. And the EOC says that's an outlier. That's a rare case. So we shouldn't have per se rule outs. But I think as somebody who issues 100,000 W-2s, you see a lot of issues on backgrounds. You see a lot of issues on resumes. What are some of the sort of things you see when people are applying for jobs that are rule outs?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest issues. How many folks in the room do run background checks or run background checks on employees? If you're not doing it, it's probably a good practice. If you are doing it, it's something you have to be cautious of just because of the way to navigate the waters. First of all, 3 out of 4 resumes that you will review most likely will have bad information, okay? Bad information, okay? 20% of the people you're looking at their resumes have fraudulent degrees. Think about the CEOs recently who have been ousted because they said they had an MBA or they had another degree. It's not unusual. 7% of the people who are applying for jobs have a felony that they're not disclosing. Okay, 7%, right off the top, 7%. So these are scary statistics. So it makes good business sense to do a background check, whether or not it's a criminal background check, checking references, credit checks, depending on your specific industry. It's critical that you're vetting the people that you're bringing into your organization. Jim brought up a great point. As an employer, we're accountable for the safety of our workforce, right? The safety of people coming into our facilities. You with Fund Company, you're going out to organizations. You have people out in the public sector. That's if something goes wrong, they're going to come and look at you and say, what did you do to make sure that you vetted those people appropriately? So it's critical that we're vetting folks. But those are some of the things that we find. Now, if background checks are so critical, then Why is it becoming so difficult? What are the things that are happening in the world right now that are making, with the EEOC, that's making it so complex for employers to make those hiring decisions? There's a number of things happening right now that are forcing employers to have to narrow the scope of their background checks. Jim, you want to share a little bit about that?
Sure. I think that if I'm going to say something nice about the EEOC as somebody who represents management against the EEOC on a regular basis, it's going to be that they tell you what they're coming after before they start coming after it. So we'll talk later on about the ADA, and 2 years ago they said an enforcement item this year is going to be accommodations of people with disabilities. They came out this year and they said one of our enforcement items is going to be background checks. So at least they tell you what's coming before they start hitting you with it. So why, I'm running a background check. How could that be an issue under Title VII? Title VII of the Civil Rights Act is what the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, enforces. How could that possibly be any of the federal government's business? Here's how. Statistically, people who are minorities are more likely to have a negative criminal background check, or negative or positive, depending upon how you're looking. Negative in terms of hireability for certain things, positive for a hit on their background check. That's a matter of statistics. For whatever reason, they're more likely to have it, whether it's the result of aggressive policing or other things, whatever the situation is. So there are two different ways you can discriminate. You can discriminate against people directly or through disparate impact. You could say, I don't like McMackin because he's a white male. That would be direct discrimination. Or you could have a disparate impact through your hiring practices, through non-overt, non-directly nefarious means, not coming out and intentionally discriminating, but you have an effect of discriminating. So what the EEOC says is you can have background checks. You can run them, you can ask people if they've ever been convicted, and you can run a background check. But it has to be narrowly tailored for the position. And there has to be some sort of limitations on what the rule out's going to be, and they have to be done on a case-by-case basis. Most importantly, you can't ask, have you ever been arrested? You can ask, have you ever been convicted, and of what? And then you can run a background check. One, I guess, kind of cute thing that a lot of employers do and actually can get away with is, have you ever been convicted of a crime? If so, what? Note that if you lie on this portion of the application, it is a rule out. So even if the person's been convicted of something that is not a rule out, something very minor, DUI, traffic offense, disorderly conduct, something like that, and they don't disclose it, you cannot hire them for the falsification of the application, even though the underlying offense was not a rule out. So the EEOC has come and said, we're going to go after employers for background check practices. And they've filed suit recently against two big companies. Dollar General, who is the largest small box retailer in the United States, 10,000 stores in 40 states, and BMW. BMW case, Todd and I were talking about this before we started, is the perfect storm. It's the perfect case for the EEOC to bring. Here's the fact pattern. They're at a plant in the South, I think it was Tennessee or Kentucky, one of the assembly plants. Tennessee. And BMW had contractors on site who were running the warehouse. And the individuals, two individuals sued. They were working for a contractor, and they were working there for a number of years under a background check. It said, if you've ever been convicted of certain offenses in the last 7 years, you're going to be ruled out. And they were fine under that policy. That contractor was replaced by a subsequent contractor. A new contractor comes in and says, if you've ever been convicted of certain offenses that were broader than the offenses that were ruled outs for the first contractor over the last 10 years, you're going to be fired. As a consequence of this new background check policy, 88 people were terminated, 70 of whom were African American. So 70 out of 88 is overwhelming. The EEOC brought the suit and said that this is having a disparate impact on minorities. the optics of this case are really bad because these people were working for BMW or through a contractor for BMW for a number of years with no problem. And now all of a sudden, they're not appropriate employees. So the EEOC has alleged in their guidance, they said, you can have a background check. You can basically ask whatever you want. You can have whatever sort of rule out you want. But they have to be, A, related to the position, and they have to be, B, judged on an individual basis. So people like Todd have to review every single background check that comes in to see what is the offense and what relation does it have to the position that they're hiring for. And we can think of, we've talked about a lot of different situations. The most extreme example is, who wants to have somebody that's been convicted of murder or manslaughter working for them? You would think that would be an automatic rule out, right? Rape, murder, arson. And we've thought of situations where if you want to have that as a per se rule out, it might be a struggle.
And for example, if you have someone who is working virtually from their home, no public contact, they have no access to anyone's personal access to their personal information, such as address information, private information. So if I'm just a customer service rep handling calls over the phone, and I never have access to a person's personal information, how the EEOC would say, their position would be, how can you as an employer authentically say that a conviction of murder would make a difference here? How is that relevant to the work that they're doing, right?
It's an extreme example.
It's an extreme example, but this is what's happening and why this is so critical, and we're advising companies across the board to really narrow that scope.
To narrow the scope and consider the gravity of each crime. And I think the best guidance we can give. Right.
So in the BMW case,
Yes.
is that a settled case, and what was the outcome, or what was the?
Unfortunately, it's still going on. The good news, good news,
Good and bad, right?
The bad news is the case is still going on, so we can't tell you how it's going to come out. Okay, it's
So you
still
guys are on this case? Is this your case?
No, it's not one of our cases. It's in Tennessee. The good news is 5 or 6 cases recently, the EEOC has been sanctioned for bringing frivolous cases. So we're hoping this is one of them. Somebody that represents management, we hope this is one of those cases where the court says, you're taking such an unreasonable position that this is going to be one of those doozies we hit you with, but we don't really have any hope that that's actually.
But they continue, even though the court's pushing back, the EEOC isn't backing off of the enforcement, which is the bad news. Because just to defend, you get to the point of a dismissal, or to that point, could be very, very costly. So that's the bad news.
Yep. So the other issue is the Dollar General case. Again, this has been filed, hasn't been litigated, still in discovery. This case was again brought on behalf of 2 employees. It's filed by the EEOC. The first applicant had been convicted of drug possession. And basically 90% of the employees of Dollar General, they perform the role of stocker/cashier. So the rest do other functions. This person was a stocker/cashier. 6 years ago, conviction of drug possession. In between 6 years ago, the drug possession, and when she was hired, or when she applied for a job, she worked for 4 years as a cashier for another company. I don't know whether it was some kind of Quick Mart or supermarket. All the case tells us is that she worked somewhere else. No problems. Amicable separation. Second employee had a felony on her record. And it was probably a rule-out felony. I don't know what exactly it was. It sounded like it was something like that. And the employer allegedly said, due to your felony on your record, we can't hire you. And she said, wait a second. You know, that's a different employee. That's not me. That's somebody else. And that's somebody that shares my name, similar biography, maybe same hometown, whatever the situation may be. But I was never convicted of that crime. And allegedly, Dollar General said, sorry about your life. We don't know that that's the case or not, but that's what the EEOC alleges. So the EEOC brought suit on behalf of those 2 employees, alleging that practice of the automatic rule-outs for drug possession 6 months ago, or 6 years ago, and not allowing somebody an opportunity to to rectify or correct, or at least dispute to some degree, things on their background check was problematic. As a consequence of these two cases, 9 attorneys general from across the country, closest one is Kentucky. Nobody from Delaware, Pennsylvania, Maryland, or New Jersey has written to the EEOC, but 9 attorneys general have written to the EEOC and said, would you please stop bringing these background check lawsuits? First of all, what you, the EEOC, are trying to do is you're trying to expand the EEOC coverage to include and encompass people who have been convicted of crimes, which is not one of the topics that the EEOC can investigate, like race, religion, disability, national origin, etc. Secondly, the attorneys generals have lobbied on behalf of companies and said that it's a legitimate interest of the employers to try to protect their workforce, to try to protect their company and their customer base by having these background checks. And third, that this final exercise that's required after receiving a background check of doing that particularized analysis and saying, this is what the person was convicted of, this is how long ago it was, this is how long there's been in between, this is what other crimes, and most importantly, this is the job function the person's going to do. By requiring that analysis for each person is unduly burdensome on the employers. So I think the takeaways are this: you can't have general broad exclusions, and you've got to give people an opportunity to rectify or correct some of the concerns. Correct.
So a small employer, we hire, every year we're hiring people. And so the background checks that we do, we'll do a driver's license. We make sure they have a valid driver's license for driving compliance. Do a financial background check. I think we'll ask them about the criminal history, but I'm not sure if we verify that. What are the background checks that every small business should do?
So that's a great question. I think let's talk about first what maybe not to do, and that might help give you some guidance on how to make the best decisions for your organization. Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
Good. So probably the first thing that you're going, and this is under the EEOC's guidance, is to narrow the scope of your check. So as Jim said, whatever you do, it has to be relevant to the job. It can't be a blanket policy, or it can be. I highly advise against it. So does the EEOC. But it needs to be narrow in scope. And it should be not just narrow in scope to your organization, but it should be narrow in scope to the job. So if you have a blanket policy for your company, that may or may not be a good decision for you, depending on whether or not you have different positions with different responsibilities and different exposures, right? So you could have some virtual workers, you could have some people who are public-facing, you may have others who aren't. And I would make sure that you're narrowing the scope of those background checks to those positions. So for example, as we talked about earlier, if you're going to have someone who's driving, looking at whether or not a felony DUI is appropriate, could be, right? Because they're out driving a vehicle that's a company vehicle, that could be a risk. That's something you might want to consider. But if I don't have someone out driving a vehicle or a forklift or in any way out in the public, felony DUI probably is not relevant. Again, you're going to have to look at your individual situation. So that's step one, is really look at the job. What does the person need to do? Do they have access to personal records of someone? Social security numbers, credit card information, client confidential information. That may be theft-related crimes may be more relevant. Misdemeanor drug conviction? Perhaps not, right? Felony trafficking? Probably. Do you see? So you really have to go through an analysis. And now I'm going to say this: we work with our clients to build adjudication grids, but they're not blanket policy grids. They're guidelines, and so they're adjudication guidelines is what we call them. They're not blanket policies, and I would suggest perhaps doing that in your own organization. That's step one. Step two: when you get the background check back, you have to currently, under the current EEOC guidance, do an individualized assessment. You have to look at the nature and gravity of the offense. So number one, what was the offense? So, if it's assault, what type of assault is it? So what's the nature and gravity? What's the time since the offense has elapsed? So was it recent? Was it within, generally, depending on state law, there's a certain time back you can go. Some states vary. In Delaware, it's 10 years.
Right.
Delaware typically 10 years. You can
Depends
go
on the
back.
industry though.
Depends, okay, got it. Some you can go back further. So you want to look at how long it's been since the offense occurred. What has the person been doing since that offense? So in the Dollar General case, you have a cashier who, while they had a conviction of a drug-related crime, for 4 years they've been working in exactly the same type of job. I'm not sure how the reference went, but depending on the reference check, if they had a positive performance in their past position, have they shown positive performance in the meantime? It sounds pretty complex, doesn't it? It's not as simple as just running a background check and saying, well, these crimes don't fit our culture. That really has to be the shift, okay, is moving away from that thought process. The other thing you want to do when you go through this individualized assessment is document it. You have to document the process, because if the EEOC ever comes knocking, you have something that shows that you actually went through the process. Now, there is currently some guidance that you can do it in written format, so that you can request them to respond to questions in writing. And if they fail to respond to you, you can then take action. Okay, so if they don't answer the questions, then you're not responsible for going through this individualized assessment, because just like the ADA and the interactive process, if they have to participate with you. Okay, does that help with that question? But anybody have any questions about that?
Let me just take your documentation point one step further. So we need to document that we went through the individualized assessment for each person. So this person had a conviction of some sort, and we want to say, okay, we didn't just rule them out, we went through the exercise, which is what Todd was talking about. But let's say you get a clean background check back, and you call the references and everything checked out just absolutely fine. And I'm going to use Greg's company, for example, because I know he does. And you hire this person. And this person is working as an IT professional for a client, and this person goes off the reservation and steals, commits fraud, commits a hack, does whatever this person does, and now Greg's getting sued. And Greg's going to want to say, but I did a background check, and I checked the references, and everything came back clean. And then when he's sued for that, if he doesn't have a copy of the file saying, here's a copy of the background check that we ran. I called these 3 background check references and they all came back clean, and this is what they said about the employee. That's going to make his negligent hiring, negligent entrustment, and negligent supervision defense go a lot easier than if he just says, I ran a background check, but I don't have a copy. I called the references, but I don't have a copy.
And I don't want to make it more complex, but I'm going to. So that's on the EEOC side. Then you take what happens one side decide to take adverse action against the person who has this item on their background check that makes them not suitable. This is where the FTC gets involved under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. Now, a lot of folks think the Fair Credit Reporting Act falls under credit checks. Not necessarily. It's any consumer reporting, and the Fair Credit Reporting Act is out there to ensure that information that's being provided about all of us is accurate, right? And that we have the ability to see that information. And we have rights when someone runs a consumer check on us. So a background check is a consumer check. So the FCRA is designed to protect individual rights under the Act. Well, if I, as an employer, decide to take an adverse action against someone who applied because of something that came on that report, there are certain things that I must do. This is one of the hottest class action. This is just started. So I expect to see this going gangbusters across the US like a wildfire, because very few organizations are tightly managing this, and there's a lot of exposure. So it's something that I would make sure I would vet and have a professional come in and really vet your process for you. But the steps that you need to follow, first of all, one, you need to, before you even run the check, you need to make sure that you provide a summary of rights. You cannot provide it in the application itself. Meaning, it can't just be on, because I want to conserve paper, or if I have an online, I put it so it's part of the application document. It has to be clear and conspicuous. Okay, that's the rule. Which means it has to stand alone. That's a best practice. It should stand alone, be clear and conspicuous. And I should on the document call out the specifics surrounding how do I get a copy of my background check? What are my rights? What is the time frame that I have to respond if something goes wrong in that check? Okay, those are my rights. So that's step one. You have to provide a summary of the rights. Step two, I decide to take adverse action now. I have to let you know and give you notice, which is called pre-adverse action, that I am going to take an action against you. I'm going to make a decision not to place you based on information that I have. And generally the best practice is give you a period of 5 days to dispute, okay, before I take adverse action. So I have to provide this to you in written form, okay? You then have 5 days, and with that I have to include a copy of the consumer report or access for you to get a copy of that report, and contact information and a summary of your rights. Again, okay, what are my rights? After I do that, after 5 days or so have elapsed, I then, and you have not disputed, I then send you a adverse action notice, okay? Those are the things you must do if you are not going to hire somebody. The FTC there are several class actions going on right now. You want to talk about a couple of them?
Sure. First one is Kmart case. This case is brought by the FTC on a class action on behalf of 65,000.
Big numbers.
65,000 applicants for employment at Kmart.
Yeah,
That's
big
a
number.
big number. So
And then that's why I'm saying this is the tip of the iceberg, guys.
here's how it worked out. Kmart had a policy that if you've been convicted of certain, and so far they think they're doing everything right. We don't have an arrest policy, we have a conviction policy. I heard somewhere that we can't rule out people who have been arrested for a crime. We can only rule out people that have been convicted of a crime. So far they're doing everything right. They went one step further. And they said, we're not just going to rule out people who have been convicted of crimes, we're going to rule out people that have been convicted of certain crimes. So far, so good.
They're trying to follow the right steps.
And they've said, we're going to rule out people that have been convicted of certain crimes, but only in the last 7 years. So far, great. They're following the rules. So they get somebody that applies, and they've been convicted of a crime more than 7 years ago. And it's in the system, and it's flagged by the background check provider. The background check provider says, can't hire Jim, he's got a felony conviction in the last 7 years. Kmart looks at it and says, it's not in the last 7 years, it's in more than 7 years ago. But you know what? The policy is what the policy is, and we rely upon our background check provider to tell us thumbs up or thumbs down for this person, and the background check provider said thumbs down. So Mr. Potential employee, I'm sorry about your luck, it's in the system, there's no way to dispute it. Right? Hence the involvement of the Federal Trade Commission. The other one is Culberson, and both of these cases are ongoing. These are all allegations.
They're fresh.
Yeah. There's no findings here. If I forget to use the word alleged, it's implied. Okay. The other one is against Disney, the Culberson case. They didn't provide pre-adverse employment action letters, step 2 of what Todd was talking about, and they didn't provide. They don't do the hiring themselves. They rely upon a vendor. And Disney's defense was, we don't provide this service. We don't thumbs up or thumbs down people. A vendor does. It's the vendor's obligation, not ours. Well, we have this contract with the vendor that says that they're responsible. The Federal Trade Commission says no. You're ultimately the one making the employment decision. So even though you're using a third party to do the determination, the obligation still falls on you as the person making the adverse employment decision to send a notice.
And the fines are substantial. I mean, just they're in the penalties and the potential here is huge. The liability is very large. So a couple of things that you can do. One is you can have your background check firm manage the pre-adverse and adverse action process for you. Just make sure that you have something in your contract that indemnifies you in case they make that mistake, because as Jim just said, even if you're using a third party to do that work for you, you still could be liable. Just make sure you have tight indemnity clauses. So let's see, here's our tips. Make sure you provide the summary of rights document, just as a summary, separate from your application. Ensure you have the written permission to run the report. Please don't run background checks or credit checks if you don't have written permission. That is a big miss. The pre-adverse action notice is critical, which includes the consumer, the summary of rights again, and a copy of the report. And lastly, the adverse action if you're not going to hire a person. Okay. Any questions about that process? Does that surprise you at all? Any surprises there for anyone?
See some heads nodding.
Yes.
Where's the biggest, I mean, there's a few things in there that are kind of come to mind with me too. Where are the biggest hang-ups for smaller employers like Greg's company or my company or a lot of other local companies? Where's the biggest hang-up?
What I see, we work with companies large and small. What we see is the documentation and the accuracy of the data. Keeping the documentation. That is so critical. It's tough. These are very tight processes that have to be closely managed, and making sure that you have those complete files is critical. And in smaller organizations, oftentimes I see that as, well, I'll do that later, and it gets missed, and that's when it would become a problem.
I see a big problem in changing mindsets, because it's hard to get people to grasp the concept that you as the employer are responsible. You're responsible for not discriminating. And whether it's with running a criminal background check, has Jim ever been convicted of a felony, or running a credit score? Does Jim have any charge-offs, bankruptcies, collection accounts, default judgments, anything like that? There's got to be that job-related risk component. And people always think, I'm the business owner. I'm going to decide who I hire. Well, guess what? There are circumscriptions in that. There really are. And the disparate impact applies not only to the running of criminal background checks, but also to credit checks as well. That's an EEOC enforcement item as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Right now, we have 10 states who restrict the use of credit checks. So I heard a few folks talk about running credit checks. Again, just like background checks, relevance is critical. There's 17 additional states with proposed legislation. Back to background checks real quick, Jim.
Yeah.
Delaware, just in January, I'm not sure if it's final yet, but banned the box.
At least I think in the city of Wilmington, possibly throughout the state of Michigan.
Yeah, it's coming. So are folks familiar with ban the box? You can't, on your application under ban the box, ask about previous. So what Jim was saying before, on the application, you could say, have you ever been convicted of anything? You say no. I run a background check. It shows something. I now don't hire you, not because of what's on your background check, but because you lied on your application. With ban the box, I'm now not able to ask that question prior to making a job offer.
It's kind of like under the ADA, where you can't ask, are you disabled? But you can ask, are you able to perform the essential functions of your job without an accommodation?
Yeah.
They're kind of going through that same procedure.
Yeah, so just keep your eye on that. That's something to have on your radar in the state of Delaware. But so back to credit checks. So credit checks, very similar There's a lot going on in terms of action against the use of credit checks. You want to talk a little bit about what's happening there?
This is a real kicker. And it's very, and Mark, I'll get to your question in just a second. The analysis is very similar to under a criminal background check, pre-adverse action, et cetera, and making sure there's no disparate impact. We've all heard of Kaplan, the education company, and they prep your kids for the SATs and the PSATs, and they help you get into law school and all that other good stuff. Well, there's a lawsuit out there called the EEOC versus Kaplan Education. Kaplan was not using background checks for a long time. And they started using them because somebody accessed financial aid data, allegedly. And they used that financial aid data to engage in identity theft. So they got the names and they got the socials and they got the address, and next thing you know, they're opening credit cards or whatever they're doing. So they got sued for that. So they said, all right, so now we need a better business practice. We're going to need to start running credit checks on a lot of people to make sure that they don't have a propensity.
Does that seem reasonable to folks? It seems reasonable. Right?
Once burned, once bitten.
Exactly, of course.
So they said, all right, well, our people are going to have access to financial data. They're going to have access to socials and probably monthly income for payment plans, and whatever the situation is. We need to make sure that our people don't commit frauds against our customer base. So we're going to run a credit check. And we're going to make sure that people aren't in distress because, as a matter of logic and statistics, people who are under financial stress are more likely to engage in acts of financial crime. And so far, making tons of sense. So they did a credit check to see, okay, what's your FICO? Do you have any charge-offs, delinquencies, et cetera, current bankruptcies, et cetera. And they only applied to people that are going to have access to cash.
So they tried to narrow the scope, right? They tried to narrow the scope.
Right. People that had access to financial information and people that had access to student loan information. So for the teacher that's going to be in there, they weren't running a credit check. But for the person in the business office, they were. So far, so good. The EEOC sues them, saying that this credit check practice has a disparate impact on racial minorities as a matter of statistics. Well, people that live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, right? Because it came out in the course of the litigation, which is not yet concluded, that for 84 of the 97 positions that are offered by the EEOC requires a credit check. So,
fascinating, right? Fascinating.
I guess they didn't do their homework before they decided to sue Kaplan for a practice that they themselves engaged in.
But again, I think they're not backing off. They're not backing off. They're still going after other employers. So same thing with background checks. If you look at some of the background checking policies within the EEOC itself, they're not as narrow in scope as what the expectation should be for employers. So it's interesting.
Yeah, it really is.
It creates a challenge. So what are some of the things that folks should do around credit checks? Same things?
Yeah, they should know the law, know the Fair Credit Reporting Act. Some states have a Fair Credit Reporting Act equivalent. Know the employment laws. Be careful about disparate impact, and the best way to do that is, like Todd said, document your process. Make your credit checks job related. If you're hiring a janitor, for example, there's probably not a need to run a credit check. I could see an argument. I don't know if it would win or not, but if you're going to be a janitor at JP Morgan or at Bank of America, maybe a different analysis. If you're going to be a janitor, at Blue Rock Stadium, right across the street, can't really see it being job related, but I'm sure there's an argument for everything.
Yeah,
so
probably.
always make it job related and make it individual.
Yeah, bingo. Somebody had a question?
I did. Regarding documentation and being an entrepreneur, I'm kind of creative, so I don't do everything in the proper process sometimes. I have this fascination with sticky notes when I'm talking to somebody. And a lot of times, if I'm on a resume or something like that, I'll make notes on a sticky note, put it on the resume, and then I'll put their file. I'm assuming that's not exactly proper documentation, or what actually defines proper documentation? Because I'm assuming when I scratch that no one else could read on the sticky note, it may not fall into that category.
As long as in your deposition, when you get sued, you can read your handwriting, you're probably okay.
Yeah. I would agree. You know, would that be a best practice? Probably not. But is that reasonable? Are you documenting? At least you're taking the step to document your conversation.
Right. There's a memorialization that the conversation occurred.
Took place, there's a date assigned to it, and it's connected to, you know, the document that we're having a conversation about.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, there are rules, if we're talking about pre-adverse and adverse action, there are rules that you would have to investigate regarding how to document that those items were sent out. Okay, so there are specific things and guidelines that you have to follow for that. I'm not sure that a sticky note would suffice.
And there's also related, but a topic for a completely other day, after hire or after offer, if you're then doing a medical check to make sure that the person is able to perform the essential function of the job, and you get data back from the doctor, that can't go along with any other HIPAA information or health information. That can't go in the same file. And not only as a matter of law, but as a matter of good practice, because there's certain things that you don't want line managers to know about. That can't go in, cannot go in the personal file.
That's a great segue to the next section, ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. Again, a very hot enforcement topic. Right now, what we're seeing trending is that generally as cases or complaints come through to the EEOC, generally what we find is that mediation is the preferred track. When it involves the ADA right now, we're finding in some states, Delaware not as much as others, but that they're moving it right to investigation, because when something becomes a hot enforcement topic, they like to investigate, which means more time, more money, greater expense for you as a business owner to have to protect your interest or to participate in the investigation. So it's a very hot topic. Let me tell you specifically what's happening in terms of the enforcement. Part of what they're looking at is everybody familiar with the Americans with Disabilities Act? Creates equal opportunity, right, for folks with disabilities. It ensures that if someone is working in your environment or applying for a job in your environment, that they have that they are able to perform the functions of the job with or without reasonable accommodation. So if I need an accommodation that does not interfere with the result, okay, remember, we don't have to change the result that we get at the end. So if I need to process 50 widgets and that's what I need somebody to do every day, it's not reasonable for me to alter that to 30 widgets, okay? That's not the expectation. What we want to do under the Americans with Disabilities Act is remove barriers, right? We want to remove barriers that stand in the way of someone actually being able to perform those essential functions. Things like, maybe a magnifying screen on a computer screen for somebody who's visually impaired. Perhaps a flashing light in a warehouse to let them know that forklifts are coming down the line. Perhaps a special stool or ergonomically correct keyboards for people with carpal tunnel syndrome or other things. Now, what's happening under the ADA, in I think it was 2008, the Americans with Disabilities Act was actually enhanced to make it less complex for folks to prove that they had a disability to qualify, okay? So what that does is it puts more onus on the employer to participate in a process which is known as the interactive process, okay? So the first step is knowing when somebody is requesting accommodation. That's probably the biggest pitfall that we see, especially with smaller employers. They're not training their line managers in understanding when someone is requesting accommodation. It doesn't, for me to request accommodation, it doesn't mean that I have to say to you, look, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, I know that it's my right to have you do X for me. That's not necessary. It may be if I'm being counseled for tardiness, and I say that it's taking me a little bit longer to get up to the, or perhaps it's because of my migraine headaches. Migraines are a great example. Okay, migraines are in most cases protected under the ADA. Okay, and based on my migraine, I may have difficulty getting up in the morning, so I'm having a little little bit of issue. So I'm running late. So I let you know, my supervisor, that I'm struggling with these migraines. And boy, if I could alter my schedule slightly, that would make a difference for me. And that's in conversation, right? I've now alerted you that I have migraines, okay? I've alerted you that it's impacting my ability to perform the essential functions of my job. And I've given you an alternative. You as a lot of supervisors would be like, no way. I'm not changing. Shift starts at 9, you need to be here at 9. That's it. I get headaches too, right? Now, be careful. At that point, now begins what should happen is the interactive process should occur. Regardless of what I feel about your request for an accommodation, whether I think it's reasonable, whether you're asking for me to build you a staircase, for you to build me a staircase to the moon, no matter how unreasonable it may seem, I am required to follow the interactive process. The EEOC states that if I don't, that's a big check mark in the favor of the opponent. Okay?
It's automatic.
It's almost automatic. Yeah, it's automatic. That's correct. It's pretty much automatic.
It's basically discrimination.
Yeah, so I need to go through. So what is the interactive process? Well, the very first thing you do is you look at the job. We're back to the job, right? Looking at the relevance of the job. What are the essential functions of the job? Look at your job descriptions, guys. Make sure that your job descriptions really detail out the essential functions. If attendance is an essential function, make sure it's in there and make sure it truly is an essential function. Really detail out what is required to complete the essential functions of the job. That's the very first step. And review those essential functions with the person who is requesting that accommodation. Okay, so you want to review the essential functions and have them explain to you what the barriers are. Okay, so let them, perhaps a question is, what can I do? What would you like to see happen here? What could make it, what could alter this for you? Have them explain and describe to you what things could occur. And again, document these steps, okay? Document this conversation. The third thing you need to do is show a good faith attempt at investigating whether or not that request is reasonable, okay? And if it's unreasonable, you need to show that it actually creates an undue hardship. And here's where it gets really sticky. The bar for undue hardship is very, very high, in my opinion.
Especially for a large company.
Yes.
For a large company, it's very
Yeah, it's very, very difficult. So you want to make sure that when you declare that this is unreasonable, an unreasonable request, that you give specific reasons why. So if you declare it's an unreasonable request, you want to document the specific reasons why. Perhaps it's cost. What would the cost be? Perhaps it's because there's not a person who can job share with that person, that it would take away from another facet. Perhaps you would have to hire another headcount in your organization. But you want to document the reasons why, because you will be called to the carpet, you'll be called to the mat to say, why did this happen? And what you want is not to be explaining it today, but you want to show why I made that decision back then. It's much more credible, especially in the eyes of the EEOC, and it shows that you follow this interactive process. And the very last step, best practice that we do, is we sit down with the individual and we go through. If we're accommodating, we go through exactly the process we went through, what accommodation we'll be making. We walk them over to the supervisor or explain what the situation will look like. We give them a resource to communicate back to if they run into any problems with that accommodation. If we're not going to accommodate, we explain to them why. Okay, so we walk through the steps with them why, and we give them a way to dispute that. And if you're in a small organization, sometimes that's difficult. But those are very specific steps that you need to go through. Any questions on that process? Yes?
Suggestion that it's hard for large companies to say they can't make accommodations suggests that it's easier for small companies. Is that
Well, it depends. It depends. larger companies may have more job sharing opportunities than smaller companies. They may have more resources. A $2,000 piece of equipment to a large company may not be a hardship, but when it's for a small company, it may be. So those are the things to really consider. There are some resources that you can reach out to that help with all accommodation alternatives that will help show that you've gone through a vetting process to look for accommodations. I can give you some of those names after, if you'd like.
And there's more to the undue hardship and the unreasonableness than just cost.
Good point.
I mean, if it's a matter of getting the person to do the job, you know, if you are the chief of the police and you're requesting an accommodation, it's different than if you're a patrolman asking for a certain accommodation, depending on what the accommodation is. If you're a third grade teacher in charge of a special education class, where you've got a very unique relationship, a learning, developmental, instructional relationship with these kids, and you request leave as an accommodation. I have sporadic flare-ups of an episodic disease, of whatever the situation is, and I might not know until the night before or the morning of or during the day that I'm going to need to just be taking off. The analysis there is different than if I'm, cleaning peaches down in Bridgeville along with 700 other people, and I say, you know what, I have that same condition flaring up on a sporadic, episodic basis. It's a completely different analysis, because for one less peach picker that day, or one less peach walker that day, it's going to have a much different effect on the mission than, for the teacher or the chief of police, for example.
Great.
Our employees, everyone works from home, and most of some employees are in the telecommutes. And we run into the episode where a particular employee needed a larger monitor, 27-inch. So we, of course, accommodated that. But we've had employees say, my God, first I need a $3,000 chair. With everyone working from their home, how does it apply to us? What is it? Do they have different responsibilities?
Who's responsible for the office? Whose equipment is it?
It's their equipment for the most part, unless they need something special, then we supply a computer. We don't supply their desks and chairs, but we can ask.
I think that's a slippery slope. We could go
It
either
is.
way.
That's tough.
Because next thing you know, it's too loud in my house because of my kids
exactly.
playing downstairs, and I have ADHD, and I'm distracted, so I need you to soundproof my home, and I need new flooring while we're at it too, because the floor makes too much noise when I wheel my chair around.
Yeah.
But that's a real slippery slope. I haven't seen that case. My initial reaction is that the person who's telecommuting is, they're taking the write-off for a home office, not you, right? Very interesting. Are they 1099s or W-2?
No, they're
W-2. Good. That's going to be our next topic.
I was going to say, we want to quickly just bring your attention to independent contractors. Small businesses use a lot of them, I find.
Yeah, when it used to be, hey, Todd, you want to come work for us? You got a 1099, you got a business license, you got your own insurance, and your own LLC?
Yeah.
You're a 1099 employee. You're responsible for everything yourself.
Be very, very careful. We don't have a lot of time to go into it, but what are some things that folks should be looking at? Because the IRS is cracking down on the enforcement under ICs, and you really want to be careful.
The IRS and the Department of Labor.
Yeah, correct.
Under ERISA.
Yeah.
And there's all sorts of different issues. Number one, Pitfalls, because I know we're running short on time. This guy used to be your employee, and now he's an independent contractor, and he's only working for you. Chances are, more likely than not, he's really, should be W-2. Big consequences for misclassification. You're telling people how to do their job and exercising control.
When to do it, timelines, directing the work, setting goals, big no-nos.
Well, and your example before about 50 widgets a day. If all I need is 50 widgets out of a day, and you send them in, and you send me an invoice, and I mail you a bill. Okay, maybe we're a true independent contractor relationship. If I say I want you to give me the blue widgets, and then the red widgets, and then the yellow widgets, and I want a package like this, and you're supposed to be here between 8 to 5 every day, guess what?
Yeah.
More likely than not, you're a W-2, especially. The big kicker is benefits. If I'm paying your health, and I'm paying, I'm withholding from your W-2s, but I'm calling you an independent contractor for some other purposes, not for IRS purposes, but DOL purposes, to skirt the FICA tax could be a big issue there, especially if you're withholding some taxes you're supposed to withhold, but not all. That's a real big issue.
Well, then you get into all the overtime issues.
What about mileage and expenses?
That can go either way. I mean, you could have a W-2 employee that's reimbursed for mileage, or a 1099 employee.
Yeah, depending if it's part of their contractual agreement. If they come to your office for a visit, you can, reimbursements are fine. Just be very careful with control scope. Control and scope, those are two of the biggest. How we doing with time? Are we? Great. Good. Well, guys, thanks for participating. Was this beneficial for you? Good. Excellent. Very, very good.
Yeah.
Let me around if you have
you.
other questions.
Yeah.
The amount of knowledge that these two have is pretty apparent given their experiences and education. So if you would, thank you, Jim and Todd.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.